You have to click this. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and start letting everyone in now.
Okay.
Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Abby and I'm a senior.
My name is Emily. I'm also a senior.
Welcome to the 2025 National Biodiversity Teach-In. We're going to be your host for this presentation.
And we have our presenter here today, and she's going to introduce herself.
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Ellen Audia. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me do that really quick. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Let me get into presenter mode. Okay. And we're off. So my name's Ellen, and today I'm going to be talking about some research that me and my colleague Katie are doing for our doctoral research at the Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, and it's specifically about bobcats in Illinois. So first, what I want to do is kind of talk about the history of land use in the country, because that's going to be kind of something that we talk about later on. So in the early 1800s, the country was kind of being settled by Europeans, and this led to a lot of drastic and continued land use changes, and the landscape was really different when they began their settlement. And today we see that a lot of the natural area, so a lot of the forests and the prairies and the wetlands, have been converted to agricultural land. So think like soybeans and corn and pasture for grazing. And in the last couple decades, we've seen that the Midwest has lost over 7 million acres of natural area. So pretty drastic, and that's even probably more today in 2025. And so because of this, we see a landscape that's very fragmented. I'm going to be saying that word a lot. So it's very, this is kind of an exaggeration, but you can think of the landscape as kind of these patches that are disrupted by, agriculture and urban land uses. And so we have these kind of like islands, these patches that are very disconnected. And that poses a lot of problems for wildlife. It's really hard for wildlife to move across the landscape when it looks like this, when it's very fragmented and disjointed. And one of the species that, struggles with this is bobcats. So now I'm going to start talking about bobcats specifically. They are a medium-sized carnivore or mesocarnivore, and they're found in most of North America. Their home ranges, so the area that they like to use most frequently, ranges in size depending on sex, but also on age, as well as the landscape in general. But males generally have larger home ranges than females, and they range anywhere between 3 and 20 square miles. And then bobcat survival is generally really high. They're considered habitat generalists, which means that they are able to use a lot of different types of habitat across the country. They have a really large range, so we can think of them surviving in like desert habitat out west, but also in tropical areas like down in Florida, and also the Midwest. But like I said, their survival is really high in most of these areas, over 70% in populations that are not harvested, and between 60 and 70 in harvested populations. And I'll talk about harvest a little bit later on. So like I said, they're habitat generalists, but here in the Midwest, so in Illinois, they prefer forested habitats and any areas with thicker undergrowth where prey is really abundant. And their prey is generally small mammals. They occasionally eat birds and bigger game such as deer. but we get a lot of pictures and videos of bobcats eating squirrels and rabbits. So those are kind of their two main prey sources in Illinois. Females and males don't generally, or I guess females don't generally overlap ranges too often. They're pretty solitary. However, during the mating season, the breeding season, males will often overlap female home ranges, and that occurs in the spring. So this is when the bobcats are breeding, and this is when the gestation happens. This is when they're pregnant. And then in the summer, the early summer, they usually give birth, and they have anywhere between 1 to 5 kittens in a litter, and there's only 1 litter per year. And then in the fall, the juveniles or the kittens become more independent. And eventually, when they reach about 1.5 to 2 years of age, they'll actually move away from their mom, something called dispersal. And this is very intentional travel. And they're going out and they're trying to make their own range away from mom, basically. And so they have a really large range, like I said, in North America. However, in Illinois, by like the mid 1900s, their populations were really starting to struggle. And this was mainly due to that habitat loss that I was talking about, but also because of overharvest. So during this time period, pelts were, so like their fur was very valuable, and so they were harvested. And that was also one of the reasons for their habitat loss or for their population declines. And so because of this, they were listed as threatened in Illinois in 1977. So they were protected. For the next 20 years, this protection really paid off, and their populations started to increase quite a bit. And so much so that they were removed from the listed status in 1999. And then eventually their populations had recovered enough that a harvest season was established in 2016. And so that is still happening. Every year there's a harvest season for bobcats in Illinois, and a very small harvest though. I think there's only about 1,000 to 2,000 tags that are given out every year. And a lot of the past bobcat research in Illinois was conducted in the southern part and also in the western part. These are areas where bobcats have kind of remained even through their population declines, mostly in the southern part of Illinois. And that's because there was just a lot of habitat down there for them to thrive in, lots of forested habitat. However, in the last 20 years, there have been studies that show that their population has started to recolonize other parts of Illinois, which is one of the reasons why there was a new harvest season established. All those dark squares are where there's lots of bobcats present. And so as you can see over the years, their populations have rebounded through most of Illinois. The yellow box in the corner is where they haven't quite recovered enough and there is not a legal harvest season. So because of this, because they've recolonized that central part of Illinois, and there hasn't been a ton of research in this area, we are focusing on these 2 counties today where we are studying bobcats. And so this is Peoria and Bureau County. And so we're just southwest of Chicago. So we're kind of like the north central part of Illinois. And if you look at the landscape, all of that like kind of light yellow is agricultural land. And then all the green is forested land. And so as you can see, the forested land kind of follows the Illinois River and its drainages, but it's very fragmented. It's very, like I was talking about, it's very kind of disjointed and spread out. It's not like big blocks of forest. And that's going to be kind of important when we talk about some of the things that we're finding. So in these 2 counties, our goals are to trap, immobilize, and GPS collar bobcats. This says 6 counties, but we've only been able to actually do this in 2 counties so far. And then my specific research is looking more at the spatial ecology of bobcats, so understanding their space use, what kind of habitats they're using, and those long-distance dispersal movements away from mom. And then Katie, the other student working on this project, she is going to be looking more at the survival and mortality of the bobcats. So how they're surviving, what's their survival rate, and some of the reasons that they might be dying. And so that first objective, we are trapping bobcats, and we do this between November and March. So kind of in the winter when they're kind of most active, they really don't mind the cold. And they're pretty desperate in this part of the year to get food, and so it's easier to trap them. And so we use a couple different methods of trapping. We use cage traps, which are shown on the left. And basically the bobcat would walk into the trap. There's a plate that they step on that depresses, and then it closes the door behind them. And inside the trap, we have like a duck wing, and then we have some like baits and lures that we use. We use a variety of different kinds. We use like a skunky smelling lure. We use bobcat urine, road-killed animals, basically anything that's really smelly and interesting. And then bobcats are very visually oriented as well. They're kind of like a house cat. So we also will hang like some tinsel or something shiny. Sometimes we use ornaments to kind of visually lure them to the trap because they're really interested in it. They're like, what is that? I want to play with that. And then we also use something called a foothold or a foot snare. And basically they step on a plate and then it closes around their paw. And these are padded and they're very safe. I've gotten my hand caught in them a couple times and it doesn't feel great, but it doesn't do any damage. And we've never had an animal like really hurt from one of these traps. And those are extremely effective. They're actually much more effective than the cage traps at catching bobcats. So that's what it looks like when a bobcat gets caught in a cage trap. They kind of freak out a little bit, and then they get to just hang out in kind of a little protected trap. And we check our traps every day, so they're never staying in there for more than 12 hours, essentially. These are some of the bobcats we've trapped over the years. I think 2 days ago, we trapped like our 45th or 46th bobcat. So we've been doing this since 2022. So we've trapped a lot of bobcats. And I know most of these ones by name. And they're all really fun and you remember all of them. We have different naming schemes every year. This year we're doing cheeses. So this guy in the top right corner is Munster. The one to the left is Asiago. We have Brie down here. So it's pretty fun. We get to, name them all. They all look slightly different and have their own personalities. And then in our traps, we also often get non-target animals, so species that are not bobcats, that we just release because we're not targeting these. So we get a lot of raccoons. We get lots of possums. We've been getting a lot of foxes lately, which is the upper right-hand corner, and we get coyotes sometimes, which is the bottom right-hand corner. And then we also get some more rare species. There's a badger that we trapped, which is kind of the top center. And then we also got a groundhog. We've gotten a couple groundhogs. And then one year we got an owl in a cage trap, which was really funny. So we get all sorts of bycatch is what we call it. And yeah, we just release these and, reset the trap and hope for a bobcat the next day. Another fun part of field work is we get stuck a lot. A lot of our traps are on private land. And so we do quite a bit of off-roading, and this is between November and March. So sometimes it's really snowy and frozen and nice because you can drive everywhere. And then sometimes you get a warm spell and everything melts and you get stuck. So kind of like one of the downsides of this work is sticky situations like this. Another really fun part is a lot of times we'll trap family groups. So in the cage trap in this video is Mama Bobcat, and then we have two babies, and we actually were able to trap both of them and put collars on them as well. And that baby at the start of the video was really interested in that visual lure that we hung above the trap. So they really do work. And you can kind of see it's like a house cat. They're really playful and cute. So once the bobcat is trapped, what do? We will chemically immobilize it. So we have a mix of drugs that are specific for bobcats. And once the bobcat is asleep, we will place a GPS collar on it, and we take a variety of samples. So we look at the teeth, and that's how we estimate the age of the bobcat based on wear on the teeth, the color of the teeth, some specific notching in the teeth. And then we usually will take a tissue sample from the ear. We'll do some measurements of the body. Sometimes we take blood. And the whole time we're doing this, we're also taking vitals of the bobcat to make sure that, its temperature is safe. It has a safe respiration rate, a safe heart rate. And if anything, is abnormal, we will reverse the bobcat out of the drug and let it recover, essentially. And so our GPS collars, which is really how we're getting most of the data for this project, they are programmed to take a GPS point every 2 hours. So like a GPS unit, that you would use to navigate. And then they also have something called a VHF telemetry unit, which is a very high frequency telemetry. And it's basically like a radio signal. And it's just like a beep. And so what's nice about that is if the GPS dies, the battery should last a year, but oftentimes they die around like 6 to 8 months. And so we still have the telemetry unit, which is on a separate battery. And that still allows us to track the bobcat manually and determine if the bobcat is still alive. So each collar has a mortality sensor. If the collar is not moving for 8 hours or more, it turns into mortality mode. And so if the GPS is working, it will send us an email that tells us, hey, it's on mortality mode. Your bobcat may have died. Or if the GPS has stopped working, the telemetry beep will change from, I think it's like 40 beats per minute for alive mode to 80 beats per minute for mortality mode. So that helps us know if the bobcat is still alive or dead. And then the collars are also programmed to drop off, like break off essentially after a year. And that's on a separate battery. So that one is guaranteed, and the bobcat doesn't have to live forever with this collar on. And then once we've done all of our workup, which takes about 20 minutes usually on average, we release the bobcat and they go and they collect really cool data for us. And so this is what some of that data looks like. This is like raw GPS data on the left. And so that collar sends out a beacon into the satellites, and then the satellite sends that GPS location back to our computer. So we can go on our computer and actually download this data. And it looks like what's on the left. And then with that data, I'm able to use like statistical programming language to essentially calculate a home range, which is basically just the area that the bobcat is using the most often. And that's what is on the right. That's what a home range looks like for this particular bobcat. And so out of the 45 that we've collared, right now, only about 20 have enough data for me to calculate like an annual home range. And that's what these are on this map right here. As you can see, Peoria, which is kind of where we're located, is right there, kind of in the bottom middle. And there's a lot of overlap in these home ranges, which is interesting. And that is maybe because we do have a lot of family groups. So we collared mom and her kittens. So they're going to overlap home ranges quite a bit. Also, there's some males that would likely overlap, female home ranges for breeding opportunities. And lastly, this is data over multiple years. And so some of these bobcats may have died or dispersed away, and then another bobcat filled in their place. And then this is just a closer look at, some of that raw data. Kind of interesting. We think these 3 bobcats were related. So we caught Phlox and Sweet William. This year, it was a flower theme for the naming. We caught them on the same day in traps that were like right next to each other on the same property. And so we think that Phlox and Sweet William are brothers, and they actually ended up dispersing kind of in the same area. So they left their mom, who we believe was Lotus, and they dispersed to north together. So it's kind of interesting to see their arrangement on the map like this. And then another family group, we trapped Blueberry, who was an adult female, and then Raspberry was a juvenile female. And there's a ton of overlap, and we're pretty positive. We trapped them on the same property around the same time. So we're pretty positive that Blueberry was Raspberry's mother, which is really interesting. And so then we can kind of start doing some comparisons with this data. We can look at the home ranges, what's driving home range size, look at differences between sexes. Males have a lot larger home ranges than females, which is, what we would expect for bobcats. But what we're finding is that these home ranges in this part of Illinois are really big. They're like double the size of home ranges in other parts of Illinois and other parts of the country. So they're really big. And one of the reasons we think is because of how fragmented the landscape is. This graph on the right shows how much cropland or how much agriculture is within the home range, and then the home range size on the y-axis, on the vertical axis. And as you increase the amount of cropland within the home range size actually tends to be larger, which kind of signifies basically that the more fragmented that the forested area is, which is their primary habitat, by this cropland, the further the bobcats have to travel to get all the resources that they need. So the bigger the home range. So it really is intuitive. It makes sense what we're finding. And then we can also understand what kind of habitat they're selecting for. So we found that they are selecting for forest cover, which is not surprising, and also forest edges, which makes sense. They use those a lot for travel as well as for hunting. They kind of hang out on forest edges, and it's usually the forest edge and like grasslands that they like, because there's lots of critters that hide in the grasslands, so they can hunt in those areas. And they're also selecting locations that are closer to streams and water bodies, which makes sense when we think back to the landscape that they're in. A lot of the forested cover is along the Illinois River, so it would make sense that they're selecting locations closer to streams and water bodies, because that's where most of the forest habitat is, and they like that forest habitat. They aren't really showing a preference or avoidance of roads, which was a bit surprising, because roads are a major source of mortality for bobcats. I think of all the bobcats that we have collared, I think over half of them have been killed, that have died, have been killed by cars, which is really sad. But they didn't show a preference or avoidance of roads. And then lastly, they are showing an avoidance of agriculture as well as urban areas, which is also not really that surprising. And then some of our bobcats that have had these GPS collars on have dispersed. So they've moved away from their mom, from their natal range, to create their own home range elsewhere. And what we're finding is that they're traveling really, really far. So on the left here, this bobcat, down in the right corner where that first yellow clump is where it started. And then all the way in the top left corner is almost to Wisconsin. So it traveled really, really far. I think it was like over 90 miles, like just a straight line dispersal distance. And then the bobcat on the right, I think, also traveled about over 90 miles. And so they're traveling really far. And if you zoom in on these like travel paths that they're taking, they're trying their best to follow that forested habitat, that small amount of forested habitat that they have. So that's something that I'm going to be looking into a little bit later, and kind of diving more deeply into what kind of habitat they're using to make these really long distance movements. And then some of Katie's work is looking at survival. What's their survival rate, and what's the probability of them surviving? And even in this population that is harvested, we are finding that their survival rate is pretty high. It's in like the 70% range, which is about what we would expect. I know that this is more of her wheelhouse, so I can't speak a ton on it, but I know that the main sources of mortality so far have been roads, like I said, as well as people who have had bobcat tags and have been harvesting them. So this GPS data also allows us to see when an adult female is denning. And it's pretty obvious by this picture where the den is. It's that really tight clump in the middle where the female has kittens, and then she's leaving, going to hunt, and then coming back to the den to care for the kittens. And so we kind of start to see this behavior, like I said, in the late spring, usually around like April, May. And then we wait until about 4 weeks after we think that she has given birth, and then we're actually able to go into the den and find the kittens, and we put these little expandable radio collars on them. So the collars will expand with the bobcat as it grows, and then eventually break off. And this is allowing us to understand kitten survival. This is something that is not studied. I think there's only one other study on bobcats. So this is something that we're trying to do and trying to explore. The first year it was really easy. It was really easy to find the den of the one female that we did have. That was this first picture, very clear where the den is. But then last summer, it was much harder to find the dens of the females. We had, I think, like 6 females, and we only were able to find one den, and it was kind of just by accident. And that's what the den looked like. It was this really big brush pile, and it was impossible basically to get the kittens out. We think there were 2, and we only were able to get 1 out. They were really deep inside this brush pile. And so she hid them really, really well, which is, what you'd expect them to do. You want to make sure the babies are really well concealed. And so this was Plum, and we actually put a collar on him, and we're still tracking him today. So he's about 7 or 8 months at this point, and he's still alive, and he's thriving. We're trying to recapture him and put one of the adult GPS collars on him so that we can continue to track his survival. And so, like I said, the dens aren't easy to get to. This was another den that we think it was a den. The female was in there. We could hear her collar beeping, and she had clustered kind of in this location, but it was like this big, deep pit under these old like field tiles, and it was impossible. We couldn't see her. We couldn't see the bobcat. We couldn't see any kittens. There were a bunch of like feathers and old squirrel tails and stuff around the den. So we assumed it was a den, but we couldn't get to the kittens. So they're really good at hiding their kittens. When we do find a den, we, like I said, extract the kittens, put the collars on them, and then we basically just put the kittens back into the den. And the mom, she is usually she knew we were there before we even got there. So she ran off, but then she'll come back and she'll continue caring for the kittens. She usually moves them to a different new den location, but then she just continues caring for the kittens. So there's no worry about us being there and holding them. So then those collars are on the kittens, and we're able to hear them. This technician, Melissa, she's holding something called a H antenna or a Yagi, and this allows us to hear that beeping noise from the collars and determine if the cat is alive or dead in the general location of where it's coming from. And so we basically are going to track these kittens for as long as possible and try to get, I guess, until they disperse, right, and find their own range, and try to get as much survival data from them as possible. And then we also are trying to do vegetation surveys at the den locations to try to understand what kind of habitat the bobcats prefer denning locations. So we're looking at things like canopy cover, so how much the trees overhead are covering the location. We're looking at like concealment of the den, what kind of substrate the den is made out of. So these types of things, so we can better understand what they like for denning habitat, so that people like the people at the DNR, land managers can better manage land to increase opportunities for females to den and increase the survival of the kittens. And so kind of the main takeaways from my talk are that bobcats are definitely in this area in north central Illinois. They've recolonized this area. We see a lot of them. I mean, we've trapped over 45. In this really fragmented ecosystem, they need a lot of space. Their home ranges are really, really big. And within these home ranges, forest cover and forest edges, especially along the Illinois River, are super important habitat for these bobcats in terms of their movement and space use and survival. And the survival is actually overall pretty high, even though it is a harvested population. So that's really good news. They're doing really well in Illinois. And then future plans for me and Katie, we're currently monitoring 15 GPS collared bobcats that their collars are still working, and 4 radio collared kittens. We have one more kitten season this summer where we're going to be going into the dens to try to collar kittens. And then with all this data that we're getting, we're basically going to be synthesizing it, analyzing it, and trying to write publications for our doctorate degrees. And with that, I guess I can take any questions. Our email is at the bottom there. I also have a personal email too.
Okay, so we collected a lot of the questions over your presentation, so we're going to ask them now, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first one is, have you ever caught the same bobcat twice, and how can you tell? Is it DNA genetics?
Yes. Okay. So I stopped sharing my screen.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes, we have. And I forgot to mention, when we do capture the bobcats, we put a pit tag in them, like the same one that you would use for your dog or your cat. So if we retrap a bobcat, we're able to scan them, and then we can determine if it's the same bobcat or not.
The next question is, what sparked your interest in this work, and specifically bobcats?
Yeah, so I've always been really interested in wildlife. I grew up in northern Michigan and have always been around nature. And I always knew I wanted to go into, natural resources, environmental science. And after I completed my master's, I was interested in doing a PhD, a doctorate degree. And this position was actually just posted like on a job board, like it would be for any other kind of job. And to me, it was kind of like a dream position, because I didn't really have a ton of experience working with bobcats or other carnivores. And I'd always kind of dreamed of doing that. And I just ended up having the right skill set that my advisor was looking for. And I was able to get the position, and I still sometimes pinch myself.
Okay, another question is, how do you protect yourselves and mitigate risk when trying to get kittens?
Good question. So we're all rabies vaccinated. That's something that that's like non-negotiable. And we do, like, that's paid for by the grant that funds this project. So that's a huge part of it. That's like the most risk, And then the kittens are small enough at 4 weeks old that they're not going to do any harm. They're pretty helpless. You can kind of just like scruff them like you would your house cat, and you can just kind of, handle them without too much risk.
Okay, the next question is, how do bobcats react with the coyote population? Do they share territory?
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot of coyotes in Illinois too. They share a lot of the same habitat. and they pretty much try to avoid each other. I would say there's a lot of like temporal partitioning, meaning that they're in the same habitat, but they are there at different times. And I'm not specifically researching that, but I know there's been others that have looked into that, and they have just slightly different timing of when they're most active.
The next question is, did you have a favorite bobcat that you've ever caught?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say probably poinsettia. She was there. I had a picture of her, but she was just sitting in the cage trap with her little paws like this, and she was just really pretty.
The next question is, has anyone ever been hurt by an animal you trapped?
No, no, we are really safe every time we have to like release an animal, or if it's a bobcat, drug the animal. We are very cautious. If there's any animal that like is showing signs of disease or something, we'll notify like our advisor, and we'll notify animal control. And we have Kevlar gloves that we wear if there's any risk of getting bitten. So we try to be extremely careful, and no one's been hurt yet. So
That's good. We love to hear that. And then the next question is, do bobcats use vocal calls that mean different things?
yes, I know they do vocalize. It's interesting. The bobcat that had the den in that really big brush pile, when we were there, she was actually the adult female who had the kittens was actually still in the brush pile, and we could see her, and she was kind of like trilling to her kittens, which was really cool. And then we kind of backed off, and she eventually left, and we could go and get the kittens. And then I know there are different like vocalizations when two males are having a standoff. I'm sure there's also different like mating vocalizations, but I haven't actually ever heard those that I know of. So
Okay, the next question is, beyond deforestation, what are some of the largest risks to the bobcat population? Do they have natural predators in the area?
no, not in Illinois. They are a top predator. The only thing I would say is that coyotes will eat kittens. So that is why the females will like create or utilize like really crazy den sites that are really hard to get to. The other like main source of mortality is just roads, I would say.
Okay, and then we have a question from our teachers. As teachers, we talk to students about the scientific process, sometimes having moments of failure. Have you ever experienced failure in your studies?
Yes, I think the biggest thing, especially with wildlife, is sample size. So, you can plan all you want about, how you expect things to go. And with wildlife, it's really uncertain if you're going to actually be able to answer the questions that you're posing. So, for example, with these den sites that I'm trying to look at and like the habitat, we only really have two den sites. So that's a sample size of two, and that is not enough to be able to make scientific claims. And and so that's like a major hiccup, especially in like wildlife research, is just actually being able to carry out the field methods and get an adequate sample size. And I haven't done a whole lot of analyses yet, but I'm sure I'll face a lot of challenges with that too. So
Okay, so the next two questions are bobcats able to be adopted, and do you have a house cat as a pet?
So I know in some areas people have rescued. Every state has different regulations. The basic answer is no. You shouldn't have a bobcat as a pet. It's a wild animal. I know in some states, like exotic animal regulations are more lenient, and some people have like rescued bobcats, like a kitten that might have, you know, its mom might have been killed or something, or it was an injured bobcat or something like that. But I generally do not recommend keeping wild exotic animals as pets, even though it sounds fun. I do have 2 cats. I also have a dog. So big cat fan, big dog fan.
Okay, and then I'm going to combine two questions. One was, how do the mannerisms of bobcats compare to other large wildcats like cougars? And how strong are bobcats compared to other big cats?
I would say most cats are very similar. Like I said, like the house cat, bobcats are super similar to the house cat. I'm assuming I haven't worked with mountain lions, but I'm assuming very similar. Um, they're a lot more elusive than, like they're not domesticated. So they're very scared of us. When we trap them, they're very afraid. And obviously that's different than a house cat. And that would be the same, I would assume, for a mountain lion as well. They're very elusive. It's hard to find them and see them.
Okay, the next question is, what is a bobcat's average lifespan?
So I believe in captivity, it can be similar to a house cat. So anywhere between like 10 to 20 years, maybe a little bit less because they're a bigger animal. In the wild, we don't really know, but I think it's anywhere between like 7 to 10 years. We've gotten some bobcats that are older, that we like have been able to kind of age using their teeth, and I think the oldest was maybe between like 6 and 7 years old.
The next question is, how can we as civilians help bobcats?
Good question. I think a big thing is like the road mortality, and so I know it's hard. It's like you can't not drive, but just being more cautious when you drive is a big thing. Um, but bobcats are very good for humans. They control the populations of those small mammals, um, and that has cascading effects down the ecological food chain. Um, but I mean, I think, yeah, it's really just the roads, at least in Illinois, that are like the major source of mortality. So be careful when you drive, people.
Okay, the next question is, will you always study bobcats or do you have any other organisms you might like to study?
I love bobcats. I've loved studying them, but I'm definitely not, you know, only interested in studying bobcats. I am from Michigan. I'd like to move back to Michigan when I'm done, and it'd be really cool to work for an agency. And usually in those roles, you're studying, all of the wildlife in the region. Um, and so, yeah, I'm not pigeonholed to bobcats at all. It'd be really interesting to study them in Michigan, though. I'd love that.
Another question is, are bobcats nocturnal hunters?
Yes, so they're most active. We call it crepuscular. So they're most active at dawn and dusk. So that's kind of like their window. But we've also, caught them like during the day too. But I would say generally, yeah, they're most active like in the really early morning and really late at night.
Okay, the next question is, how do bobcats establish and defend their territories?
So it's mostly through scent marking. They don't like to interact. I know they do sometimes, but it's mostly through like latrine sites. So with their poop, or with their pee, they spray, just like a house cat, would do that. And they kind of just know, like they can smell that and they know to kind of avoid that area.
The next one is, how do bobcats adapt to seasonal changes in temperature?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I know they're extremely hardy. Like they can withstand a lot of different climates. Like they dip down into Mexico and all the way up into southern Canada, so they can really withstand a lot of different climates. And I don't really know if any of that has a lot of work like that has been published for bobcats. So not sure.
The next one is what physical adaptations make bobcats successful predators?
Yeah, that's a good question. They are pretty good in the snow. They have bigger feet, so they're able to move through the snow pretty effectively. They have those front-facing eyes, which is really good for being a predator. They're ambush predators, so they kind of just like sit and wait, and they can camouflage really well because their pelage, their pelts are kind of spotty, which and it also changes across the country too. Like some bobcats I know out west are like more orange, kind of like desert colored, and then the ones here are more like gray and they blend in with like the gray foliage. So that's a big thing, is being able to disguise themselves so they can sit and wait, and then they ambush their prey. And they're really soft-footed too, and so they can be really quiet.
Okay, next question is, what educational path do you recommend for a young person interested in studying wildlife?
Yeah, I would say you definitely need at least an undergraduate degree, probably in something like biology or ecology or natural resources, and then if you'd like to be some like a manager of wildlife, a master's degree is not a bad idea, and that would be in a similar field. Um, but I would say a lot of the experience comes from jobs, from like internships, and seasonal positions where you're actually getting out and you're kind of applying those skills that you learned in school to like the field. And so in my undergrad, I was able to have like a few different internships that took me to a bunch of different places and helped me get involved in research that was related to ecology and wildlife.
Okay, so the last question we have, you've already mentioned your favorite bobcat, but is there any that was the most memorable other than that one, or the one with like a strong personality?
We had one that he we had given him the drugs and he was asleep. Usually what happens is we'll give him the drugs, we let them fall asleep for about like 10 minutes. That's usually how long it takes. And then we go up and we make sure that they're asleep. We kind of like clap and we make noise, and then once they're not responding, we kind of like pinch their ears and make sure that they're asleep, right? So this bobcat was totally asleep. We took him out of the foothold trap, and as soon as we took him out of the foothold trap, and my technician was holding him, he woke up. And so she essentially just had to like hold him. He was still kind of like out of it, but she essentially just had to hold him down. And then we got one of the cage traps that we had, and we put him in there, and we were able to give him like another dose of the drugs. And it turned out that we had underdosed him a little bit, and we just estimate the dose by weight. So it's kind of hard. Sometimes you're over or under just by a little bit. So we just had to give him a little bit more, and then he was asleep and he was fine. But that was definitely the most memorable.
Okay, and then I just thought of a question of my own. You mentioned that you want to like study the bobcats in Michigan. Do you think that your studies in Michigan will be any different than the ones in Illinois?
It's a good question. There's right now there's kind of like their range in Michigan does not include like Southwest Michigan. And so I personally think it would be really interesting to do a similar study in that area. And if you look at the landscape, it's really similar to north central Illinois. There's the Grand River that runs through it, and there's a lot of agricultural land. So I think personally it would be kind of similar to this study. So it would be really interesting to look at.
All right, that is it for all of our questions, unless anyone who's watching has some last questions. But we really appreciate your presentation. It was really good and super interesting, and we loved all the pictures. They were super cute.
Oh, good. Thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Oh, we have another one. You kind of talked about this a little bit, but how do you drug the cats?
Yeah, so if it's in a cage trap, we have like these forks that kind of like push the bobcat to like a corner of the cage, and then we're able to we just use like a needle that you would get like a shot at the doctor. It's similar to that, and we just inject it that way. If it's in a foothold, we have these two like they're like it's like a pole that comes into a Y and it's all padded, and you just kind of hold it down and you hold it under like its armpits and under its butt, and it kind of just pins the cat down, and then we're able to just inject the drugs.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking time in your day to do this, and we really do appreciate you.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you so much. Take
Thank
care.
you. Bye.
Bye.